I'm Alicia Lucy. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. We're a statewide nonprofit policy and advocacy organization dedicated to preventing and ending homelessness and expanding affordable housing in Connecticut. Today's IForum is 10 years in the making. A decade ago, Connecticut began experimenting with what would happen if we incentivized towns to take a serious look at their housing stock and zoning and identify what housing options they needed in order to be more vibrant communities. The results are significant. Over 40% of towns across the state have taken part in the Department of Housing's Incentive Housing Zone program. Dozens have revised their zoning to encourage density and multifamily housing, and hundreds of mixed-income apartments are being created. These towns have realized that affordable housing is not scary, and that we are in the midst of profound demographic and economic changes that require different housing options to stay healthy into the future. They've also realized that it's in their interest to create housing beyond single-family home ownership. Today we'll hear from 5 different towns who are at different points along this process. All have in common that they previously had very little experience in proactive housing development and regulations that hindered affordable housing creation. Our keynote speaker, Richard Rothstein, will describe how post-war federal policy created many of the housing challenges we are facing today, having fostered segregation, wealth disparity, and lack of opportunity and access to schools and services. This problem was compounded in Connecticut by the way that the state developed, with individual towns responding to the needs of the baby boomer generation, without creating the spectrum of housing choices necessary in order to grow and to meet the needs of aging residents. Thank you all for being here today. We're thrilled to have an audience of planners, developers, lenders, state agencies, advocates, and other community stakeholders. The partnership continues our commitment to highlighting the interdisciplinary nature of housing with its IForum series. We know that housing can help solve the problems and challenges faced by transportation, education, employment, and healthcare, and beyond. We want to thank our program sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Department of Economic and Community Development, the Connecticut Housing and Finance Authority, Webster Bank, Bank of America, and the Melville Charitable Trust. We especially want to acknowledge the work of the Department of Housing and Commissioner Klein, who both at DOH and CHAPA has shaped policy to create tools to create new housing in areas of high resource and greater opportunity. I also want to thank the incredible staff of the Partnership for Strong Communities who put a tremendous amount of work into these events, and particularly Katie Schaefer, who led the planning of today's event. So thank you, Katie. We aim to keep these events free and open to the public, but we ask that you consider making a donation to support that effort. A donation box is actually by the elevator, and you can also inquire with any of our staff if you'd like to learn more about how you can support this effort. I'm also supposed to let you know that we will be live tweeting, and hopefully I'll get this right, at PSC Housing, #IForum 2016, if you'd like to follow along. Clearly not a skilled tweeter. And now to introduce today's discussion, I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Condon. Hartford recently retired, but still in high demand, David tells me. Hartford Courant columnist and editor and journalist. Please join me in welcoming Tom Condon.
Anyway, welcome to Hartford's historic Frog Hollow neighborhood. And I want to draw your attention to the neighborhood. 19th century manufacturing neighborhood. They made everything here. Sharp's Rifles. Capitol Avenue was once called Rifle Street. Weed sewing machines. The original Pratt & Whitney was down the street. Underwood typewriters, Columbia bicycles. An amazing history, and also note, and you can see to this day, worker housing. It was understood in 1870 that there had to be a nexus between work and housing. And some of the housing in this neighborhood was designed by the premier architect in the city at that time, George Keller, the Columbia Street houses. But again, there was an understanding that workers important to the community had to have places where they could afford to live. Now, it seems obvious, but it was, for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll hear about today, forgotten in the 20th century. Racist housing policies, and also the post-war suburbanization rush, sometimes called sprawl, in which mostly white people who could afford to left the cities and moved to the suburbs. Now, this was considered progress for a long time, but as the poet Ogden Nash once said of progress, it was fine for a time, but went on too long. They turned out there was a belated realization that there was a downside to sprawl. There were environmentally increased air pollution, a lot of more pavement, increasing water pollution, increased the need for new infrastructure, increased the cost of services, and also limited housing variety. Isolated the poor in cities, and in some cases senior citizens eventually in the suburbs. Even by creating a car-dependent society, increased the obesity problem. So there were a lot of downsides, but focusing on housing variety, there has eventually, some suburban towns were left with 90+% single-family large lot housing, which raised the cost of housing and made a lot of communities almost impossible for middle-class people to live in. And there has come now, finally, thanks to Home Connecticut Project and the insight of many town officials, a realization that there needs to be more housing variety, and it needs to be mixed income. For people moving there, it means an opportunity, a choice of where to live, the possibility of getting their children into good schools. For the towns themselves, it's the opportunity of, as in 19th century Frog Hollow, keeping workers who are important to the community in the community. You want teachers living in the community. You want police officers and firefighters living in the community. Human nature says you're more involved in the place where you live. So we've made progress. We'll hear about that this morning. We'll hear about, from Richard, how this problem was created, and then from 5 town officials as to how they're solving it. So again, welcome to Frog Hollow. Thank you.
I'm Katie Schaefer. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at the Partnership. Thank you, Tom, for so eloquently framing this morning's discussion. Today we're going to hear from hardworking towns across our state that are providing housing choices for all households. But before we hear about those efforts, we thought that some context was needed, an explanation of how we as a country found ourselves in our current housing landscape. Our keynote speaker, Richard Rothstein, has presented in Connecticut before. But since he was last here, many pivotal events transpired that have caused us to think that a reprise was warranted. Last summer, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the disparate impact standard under the Fair Housing Act, holding that housing practices or policies that appear to have the effect of discrimination, even if unintentional, are prohibited. These include zoning laws and other housing constraints. Also over the summer, HUD issued a new rule explaining the steps that local governments must take to ensure equal access to housing. And these advances are set uncomfortably against the backdrop of riots and violence that have transpired in Ferguson and Baltimore. Richard has written extensively on racial segregation and public education. He was formerly the national education columnist for the New York Times and has authored several books on the subject of closing the achievement gap. His 2014 report, The Making of Ferguson, documents the history of state-sponsored residential segregation. We're thrilled he could join us during a very busy speaking tour on the East Coast, and I'm happy to welcome him here this morning.
Thank you very much, Katie, Alicia, all the rest of you for having me here today. The work that you're doing is, as you know better than I do, very important, and its success is ultimately dependent on public support. The major challenge you face in developing that public support is a widespread belief across the political spectrum, not only in Connecticut, but around the country, that the problems that we face in housing today, the racial segregation of every metropolitan area in the country, the racial segregation of every metropolitan area here in New England, is something that we've come to call de facto. It just sort of happened. It happened because African Americans don't typically have enough money to move to middle-class communities. It happened because of white flight, people who decided to leave urban areas when African Americans moved in. It happened because of real estate agents who steered African Americans to some neighborhoods and whites to others. It happened because people like to live with one another of the same race or ethnic background. All of these things just sort of happened and came together to create the de facto segregation that we're familiar with today. And the Supreme Court has adopted this notion of de facto segregation. And according to the Supreme Court, to the Roberts Court, to the Rehnquist Court that preceded it, to the Berger Court that preceded that, when you have de facto segregation, segregation that occurred because of all the causes that I just described, it would be a nice thing if people like you could do something to correct it. But we can't require you to do it. We can't require the state of Connecticut to do it because it wasn't created unconstitutionally. It was created essentially by private action, by economic differences, by demographic trends, and so forth. There's a requirement to do it, a requirement to desegregate metropolitan areas, a requirement to do the kinds of things that you are hoping to do, only if it was created, if the problem was initially created by public policy, by state action, by racially conscious public policy. In that case, we have something called de jure segregation. Segregation by law, by public policy and regulation. And since we have none of that, there's no obligation to undo it. Well, what I want to spend a few minutes speaking with you about today is that this conventional view, which is across the political spectrum, it's not just a view held by conservatives, it's a view held by liberals, as I say, by the entire Supreme Court. It's a myth. The reality is we do not have de facto segregation in this country. We have de jure segregation. The segregation in metropolitan areas in Connecticut, in New England, and throughout the United States was created by racially conscious, explicit public policy. Not the disparate impact of policies that have benign purposes, not the unintended consequences of policies created for other reasons, but racially conscious, purposeful public policy. And the residential segregation that has resulted from that is unconstitutional. We're living in an unconstitutional residential environment in Connecticut and throughout the country. And if we understood that, and if the public understood that, and if policymakers understood that, we would understand that there's not just an opportunity to undo it, there's not just a good idea to undo it, but there's a constitutional obligation to undo it. And so what I wanted to do is describe to you some of this background and make the argument to you that unless we come to a better understanding of how all this happened, it's going to be much more difficult to gain the public support that you need in order to desegregate Connecticut, and the rest of us, the rest of the desegregated, the rest of the country. Now, there were two major policies implemented by the federal government that created segregated metropolitan areas on purpose, racially conscious. Again, I want to emphasize this was not the disparate impact of well-intentioned policies, purposefully racial segregation, purposeful racial segregation. Two major policies implemented by the federal government with state and local support. One was the public housing program. The other were the policies of the Federal Housing Administration. There were many, many other policies implemented by federal, state, and local governments in support of it, but these were the two major ones, and I'm going to devote most of the time I have this morning to these two major ones. And I put up on the screen here my website, as well as contact information. You can ask me further questions about this, and I'd be delighted to correspond with you about it. And on that website, you'll find articles that describe many other policies implemented by federal, state, and local governments with the purpose of creating racial segregation. Let's begin with public housing. Public housing, as we know it today, is not how public housing began. Actually, the first public housing in the country, created by government, housing created by government, was created during World War I for workers in munitions plants. Bridgeport, Connecticut was one such site where housing was created by the government for white workers only. There was a great migration to the north to work in munitions plants during World War I. African Americans came to Connecticut in large numbers for the first time to work in munitions plants. The federal government built housing only for the white workers explicitly. It's not that the white workers applied to live in the public housing and the black workers didn't. It was explicitly restricted to white workers. African Americans who came to work in the Remington Arms and other plants in Bridgeport around the country were forced to crowd together in tenements and in substandard housing, beginning the first ghettos in the state of Connecticut and in many places around the country that later grew to form the outlines of metropolitan segregation that we have today. But that was a fairly minor program. It only took place in places where there were large munitions factories operating. The first civilian public housing that was created by the government in this country, not simply for munitions workers, but for civilians who needed housing in general, came during the New Deal. One of the first programs of the New Deal was the Public Works Administration, headed by Harold Ickes, liberal, the former president of the Chicago NAACP. He was the Secretary of the Interior under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Public Works Administration began a program of public housing around the country. It was for white workers primarily. Ickes, as I said, was a liberal. His liberalism was expressed on his insistence that some housing be built for black workers as well, not integrated housing. But that in addition to the white public housing that was built, we should build some housing for African Americans as well. We needed public housing at that time for middle-class families. This was not a program for poor people. Poor people were not eligible for public housing during the New Deal. It was only for middle-class, working-class families because there was an enormous housing shortage in the New Deal. Housing wasn't being built. There was no... People were being evicted from their homes and losing their homes because they couldn't afford to keep up the payments or to pay the rent. And so there was an enormous need for housing. So the Public Works Administration built public housing for white families primarily, with some housing built for African Americans in separate projects. This was federal housing policy. This was not something in the South. This was not Jim Crow South policy. This was throughout the United States. Public housing on a segregated basis was built by the Public Housing Administration in New York, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in cities across the North and Midwest. Ickes' policy, stated policy, was something he called a neighborhood composition rule. The neighborhood composition rule said that public housing should be open to people of a race that was predominant in the neighborhoods where it was located. So it was a deferral to existing segregation in neighborhoods. But that's not actually how it worked, because in the 1930s, many, many urban neighborhoods were integrated. They were integrated unlike anything we have today, because workers of all races and ethnicities during the 1930s who didn't have automobiles and who weren't able to live in the suburbs, there were very few suburbs at the time that had been built, had to live in downtown areas where they could all work for the same factories to work, or walk to the same factories to work. And so you had neighborhoods and urban areas across the country in which Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, African Americans, migrants from rural areas, all lived in the same neighborhoods so they could walk to factories to work. And the Public Works Administration demolished many of those neighborhoods because they were considered substandard housing, tenement predominated, overcrowding, and built segregated housing in its place. So rather than following a neighborhood composition rule, which would have built integrated housing in these integrated neighborhoods, instead the Public Works Administration segregated neighborhoods for the first time. They created segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Again, establishing patterns in major metropolitan areas that exist to this day. In St. Louis, which I've written a lot about, again, you can find an article called The Making of Ferguson on my website. In St. Louis, there was a downtown area called the Solo Car. It was about 55% white, 45% African American. The Public Works Administration demolished that neighborhood in cooperation with the St. Louis Housing Authority. Eventually, a project only for African Americans was built in that downtown area, and a separate project for whites only was built south of downtown, creating a pattern that we now see in St. Louis, and which eventually led to the segregation of not only downtown St. Louis, but the suburbs surrounding St. Louis, creating a pattern that exists today of African Americans concentrated on the north and central sides of St. Louis, and whites concentrated in the southern and western parts of the city. Same thing happened in Cleveland. I remember reading the autobiography of Langston Hughes, which he described growing up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood at the beginning of the 20th century. He took a Jewish girl to the prom. He had Italian-American friends. It was an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration built segregated housing in that neighborhood, separating African Americans from whites and creating a pattern in Cleveland of segregation for the first time. World War II saw a particular growth of public housing because, again, the government had to build housing for the mass of African Americans and whites who moved to cities where defense production was going on. I now live in Berkeley, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Very few African Americans lived there before World War II. In Richmond, California, just north of Berkeley, the major shipbuilding area of the Pacific Coast, Kaiser shipbuilding yards had tens of thousands of workers there building ships. There were no African Americans in Richmond before World War II. 250 of them, in fact. There was the total African American population of the city, working mostly as domestics and other servants in white homes. By the end of World War II, there were over 10,000 African Americans living in that city. The white population began at about 15,000. By the end of World War II, it was 100,000. I don't know if you can imagine what a city is like if it has that kind of growth in 4 years. Well, there's no place for people to live who flock to Richmond and the Bay Area to work in these shipyards. And so the federal government built housing. Again, segregated public housing. This is the north. This is the Bay Area of San Francisco, the liberal area of the country. This was not something that happened in Georgia or Tennessee or Mississippi. The federal government segregated Richmond, creating a segregated community where segregation had never existed before, and built African-American housing along the railroad tracks near the shipyards, very low-quality housing, built much higher quality housing for white workers in the shipyards, further inland in the white residential neighborhoods. This, again, went on throughout the country, creating segregated patterns that hadn't existed before. At the end of World War II, there was, again, an enormous housing shortage in the country. And returning war veterans came to need housing throughout the country, gave birth to baby boomers, needed to form families. There was again a shortage of housing even before the veterans returned to the country, because during the war, materials for construction were prohibited for use for civilian purposes. It was all being directed to the war efforts. You had a big buildup of demand for housing. And this continued. War veterans were coming home and living in Quonset huts, and of course doubled up with forming families and having marriages in their in-laws' apartments, enormous overcrowding. And in the 1940s, President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt as president when Roosevelt died, President Truman proposed a massive new public housing program to supplement the programs that had been done by the war housing efforts during the war. He proposed the 1949 Housing Act, and it was a massive public housing program, again, primarily for whites. This was for returning war veterans who had no place to live, middle-class, working-class families. Conservatives in Congress were opposed to public housing, not for racial reasons particularly, but because they were opposed to any government intervention in the private market. They said this was the private market's job to solve this problem, notwithstanding the fact that the private market hadn't been solving the problem at all. We had this enormous shortage. But they were opposed to public housing. And they decided that the way to defeat Truman's public housing program was to introduce in Congress an amendment to the public housing bill, which a kind of amendment that we now call a poison pill amendment. A poison pill amendment is an amendment which opponents of a bill put on a bill, hoping that if it passes, it will make the bill unpalatable to all of its supporters. It's a poison pill amendment. Perhaps the most famous contemporary poison pill amendment was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when opponents of civil rights put forward an amendment saying that discrimination had to be prohibited not only by race but by sex. Ha ha ha, that would never pass. Well, the poison pill amendment passed, but it didn't wind up defeating the entire bill, and that's how we got prohibitions on gender discrimination in this country, was by a flawed poison pill amendment. Well, in 1949, conservatives in Congress were opposed to public housing, proposed the poison pill amendment, and their amendment was that henceforth all public housing had to be integrated. No more segregated public housing, no more discrimination against housing. Understanding that if the non-discrimination amendment passed, Southern Democrats would then vote against public housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat, because public housing and all of the economic programs of the New Deal and of the Truman administration were built on a coalition of Northern and Southern Democrats on condition that it be segregated. So they thought that if this amendment passed, the entire bill would fail. And liberals in Congress, well, I see this is an audience where some people will remember these names, liberals in Congress, led by Hubert Humphrey, and led by the leading liberal in Congress, Paul Douglas, a senator from Illinois, campaigned against the non-discrimination amendment, against the integration amendment, saying that, which was true, if the integration amendment passed, there would be no public housing at all, because the coalition that was supporting it, including Southern Democrats who wanted segregated public housing in their states, would then vote against it. And so Humphrey and Douglas led a campaign to defeat the integration amendment, and it was defeated. And the 1949 Public Housing Act was adopted as a segregated program. And this is not something that was done in southern states. This was a national program. And it wasn't so long ago. 1949, the NAC adopted a national public housing program, segregated program. Well, under that program, segregated housing was built across the country, in the north. You know, the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. You know, in St. Louis, the most famous project was the Pruitt-Igoe towers. Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis was originally two projects. The Pruitt project was for African Americans. The Igoe project was for whites. Two separate projects, federal projects, segregated by design. As the projects opened, large vacancies developed in the White Project, in the Iowa Project. The Pruitt Project had long waiting lists. And eventually St. Louis and the federal government opened up the Iowa Project to African Americans. Whites left en masse and eventually became a entirely African American complex. Jobs disappeared at the same time from St. Louis, and so the incomes of the residents became lower and lower. It eventually became a national symbol of dysfunctional public housing, and in 1972, the federal government dynamited it. Some of you may recall reading about this or seeing pictures on television of the dynamiting of the Pruitt Towers, and that led to the end of public housing generally throughout the country. Well, how did it happen that there was suddenly all of these vacancies in the Iowa Towers, that whites no longer wanted public housing? It was not because whites suddenly got wealthier and African Americans didn't. The reason that the vacancies developed in the Iowa Project was for another federal program that was administered by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration embarked on a program originally started at the beginning of the New Deal, but it really ramped up after World War II, to suburbanize the white population and keep the black population in urban areas. Again, this was an explicit policy. It wasn't an accident. It didn't happen because whites wanted to leave the suburbs and African Americans wanted to stay in cities. The federal government had an explicit policy to suburbanize the white population in single-family homes and retain African Americans in urban areas in multifamily dwellings and apartments. The Federal Housing Administration gave production loans to builders to build entire subdivisions on condition that the subdivisions that they built be open only to white families. The most famous of these subdivisions is Levittown in New York. It was the largest one, 17,000 homes built in 1947 for returning war veterans primarily. The federal government, Levitt could never have come up with the money himself to build 17,000 homes before they were sold. The only way he came up with this money was by going to banks with a Federal Housing Administration guarantee and getting production loans for the production of Levittown. And that guarantee was based on his commitment not only to exclude African Americans from buying homes in Levittown, but to include in the deed of every home in Levittown a prohibition on resale to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. And subdivisions around the country were built in this way, and that's how the country became suburbanized, how the white population came to be suburbanized. Some of you may recall hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about houses on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. This was a song written about Westlake in Daly City, south of San Francisco. Another giant development built with Federal Housing Administration guarantees on condition that no homes be sold to African Americans. And across the country, everywhere, suburbs were built in this way with FHA production guarantees that enabled these suburbs to be built and restricted to white families only. So these two policies of the federal government that applied to the north as well as to the south, and was not a segregationist policy to the south. Two policies: public housing designed to restrict African Americans to urban areas and multifamily housing. Federal Housing Administration suburbanization designed to expel the white population from urban areas and locate them in single-family homes in the suburbs. These two policies were the main ones that suburbanized white population and created segregated metropolitan areas everywhere. Now, what are the consequences of this policy today? Just briefly, give you one example. I mentioned Levittown a minute ago. Levittown, built in 1947, 17,000 homes. They sold for $7,000 a piece when they first went on sale. Very small, simple, mass production homes, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. $7,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. So I'm going to stop talking about 1947 dollars. I'll just convert it from now on to current dollars. About $100,000 a piece these homes were bought for. African Americans could have purchased those homes. $100,000 is about twice national median income. A home that sells for twice national median income is affordable to working class, to lower middle class families. African Americans could have bought those homes as easily as whites could have, but African Americans were prohibited from buying those homes. Today, and the African Americans who were prohibited from buying homes in places like Levittown were then restricted to ghettos of Harlem and elsewhere around the metropolitan area. Today, homes in Levittown sell for $400,000, $500,000. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 and said, okay, African Americans, you're now free to move to Levittown. You're now free to move anywhere you want. You can't be prohibited from moving to places like that. But today, those homes will sell for $400,000, $500,000. That's 7 or 8 times national median income. Homes in the suburbs that were created for working class families on a segregated basis in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s are no longer affordable to working class and lower middle class families today. The white families who bought those homes gained over the course of the next 2 or 3 generations $300,000, $400,000 in equity appreciation. They used that equity to send their children to college. They used that equity to retire to Florida. They used that equity to bequeath to their children and to their grandchildren. African Americans gained none of that equity because they were prohibited from buying homes at a time when they were affordable. The result is that today, African American income, that is the wages that they earn from the jobs that they have and other minor sources of income, is about 60% of white income. African American wealth is 6% of white wealth. The difference between 5 or 6% of wealth and 60% of income. And this difference in wealth, which is the main reason why the segregation persists and why African Americans are now trapped in low-income segregated neighborhoods throughout this country, is almost entirely attributable to racially conscious federal policy. Now, this history has been suppressed. It's been forgotten. You don't have to believe me as I say that. I have full citations, sources. You can see the documents on my website. Don't take my word for it. Look at the history yourself. It was once well known. It's nothing I'm saying now to you is something I discovered myself. It was once well known 40 or 50 years ago. Public officials who were willing to talk about this talked about how the federal government had created a white noose around African American neighborhoods, and it was the federal government's job to untie that noose. Perhaps the best known public official who talked about this was George Romney, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Nixon administration, who recited this history, knew it very well, and began a program to try to desegregate the suburbs and enable African Americans to move there. He required suburbs to repeal their exclusionary zoning ordinances. He required suburbs to have their fair share of low and moderate income housing. He required suburbs to pass non-discrimination ordinances. And he was pulled back by President Nixon, eventually forced down as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And since then, there's been virtually no discussion of this in the public sphere, and we've forgotten the history that, as I say, at that time was well known. I think you heard that I used to spend a lot of time studying public education. So this is a particular concern to me because I'm fearful that if we continue to teach the myth of de facto segregation to our children, the next generation will be as little prepared to deal with the problems that we're trying to deal with as we are. And so I looked at all of the textbooks, the most commonly used in American high schools today, teaching American history. And without going into a lot of them, let me just describe to you the main one. The most commonly used American textbook in classes in high schools today in this country is something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages. Kids have to carry this around and put them in their lockers. In this 1,200 pages of The Americans, most commonly used textbook in the country. There's one paragraph devoted to segregation in the North. In that one paragraph, there's one sentence devoted to housing. And in that, the one sentence reads as follows. It says, in the North, I'm quoting now, in the North, African Americans found themselves in segregated neighborhoods. That's what we teach in our children. They woke up one day, whoopie-doo, here we are in the segregated neighborhood. I can tell you how to proceed with your housing programs. I can say that without public understanding of the constitutional obligation to undo the unconstitutional creation of segregation that I described, it's going to be much more difficult to get the popular support you need to pursue your programs. But one thing I can say you can do immediately, and that is every one of you lives in a school district, and why don't you go examine whether the children in your school districts are being taught the kind of nonsense that I've just described to you, and whether they're being prepared to have the understanding that will lead them to support the kinds of programs that you're trying to pursue. Because unless we do a better job of educating the next generation as well as the current policymakers about the history of jury segregation, of the purposeful efforts of the federal government to segregate this country, I think there's very little chance that we'll develop the popular support that's needed to desegregate our metropolitan areas. So I think we have 10 minutes for questions and answers, and I could talk about this for 10 years if you let me. But I'd be happy to take questions and engage in a discussion with you. And if we don't have time for all of your questions, please feel free to email me at the address on the screen, and I'd be happy to engage in that discussion with you. Penny, should I call on people, or will you have?
A question. There was a 6-year period of countywide school desegregation programs prior to the 1974 Detroit decision. Was that an effective way to desegregate metropolitan areas?
No. The reason you've heard, and I've said in the introduction, that I used to focus almost entirely on education policy. And I gradually came to the realization that we couldn't close the achievement gap in schools, in segregated schools. And then, it took me a long time. I'm not that smart. It took me a long time to realize this, that you couldn't desegregate schools without desegregating neighborhoods. Because you could, do some busing in borderline areas and create magnet schools, and a lot of good stuff is being done here in Hartford, the chef segment. But most ghettos in this country are too far distant from truly middle-class schools to accomplish significant school desegregation with busing or with these other programs. They can make some difference in borderline areas, but I personally believe in neighborhood schools, in schools that are located in integrated neighborhoods. So unless we desegregate neighborhoods, and if we're going to do busing and magnet schools and attendance line adjustments in an attempt to integrate, what we're going to do is we're going to integrate the most disadvantaged African American population into inner-ring suburbs with lower middle class white population. The affluent white suburbs, which are the real culprits in this story, are going to be untouched because they're too far distant from ghetto areas to accomplish significant desegregation. So I think a fair share program, an aggressive program to desegregate metropolitan areas is essential if we want to solve the achievement gap problem as well as segregated schools. I'm not opposed to these, short-term busing problems, but they don't address, the ghettos are too far distant from middle-class neighborhoods.
Katie spoke of a Supreme Court ruling and a new campus. Could you talk to us a little bit about either of those and what the future looks like under those, how we can implement them or how we're affected by them?
Well, the Supreme Court made a ruling last June that permitted, under the Fair Housing Act, it wasn't a constitutional ruling, it permitted under the Fair Housing Act the HUD and the Department of Justice to pursue cases where policies that weren't explicitly racial had a disparate impact in perpetuating segregation. And the case itself arose because throughout the country, the low-income housing tax credit is used disproportionately to reinforce segregation. Low-income housing tax credit units are disproportionately placed in already segregated low-income neighborhoods. That's not their intention. Unlike the policies I described earlier, the low-income housing tax credit program is not designed for the purpose of racial segregation, the way in which the FHA programs were, the public housing programs were. But once we've established the segregated landscape, the land is cheaper in segregated neighborhoods. There's an easier market to market the apartments. So low-income housing tax credit developments wind up mostly in segregated neighborhoods. Well, a Texas group, civil rights group, sued the state of Texas, saying that even though Texas didn't have its quality allocation plans and its other low-income housing tax credit rules designed for the purpose of racial segregation, the fact that all of these units were being placed in segregated neighborhoods had a disparate impact on segregation, and under the Fair Housing Act, the Texas Department of Housing could be prohibited from this kind of policy and had to figure out a way of putting more low-income housing tax credit programs in high opportunity neighborhoods. This is, I think, an important step. HUD is now talking about more aggressively requiring housing policies and subdivisions to pursue integration. But frankly, and I don't mean to be pessimistic about this, but my view, as I've said in the last few minutes, is that there's no public support for aggressive enforcement of this kind of policy, of an aggressive integration policy. I'm not going to comment on why the Obama administration decided to do this in its 8th year. But there's no public support. Even if they did try, even if they had done it in their 3rd year, there would have been the kind of backlash against it that George Romney faced when he tried to do similar programs. My view is that we have to have much more discussion, public discussion, of the jury-segregated nature of our metropolitan areas, to build the kind of public support that will allow HUD and civil rights groups and housing groups to take advantage of this disparate impact ruling. Because I don't think they'll get away with it. I don't think HUD will get away with it if he tries to do anything aggressive. This week, Secretary of Transportation Anthony Fox gave a speech, a very important speech, in which he acknowledged that the Interstate Highway Program was built with the specific purpose of destroying African American communities and concentrating African Americans in more overcrowded ghettos. It's a very important acknowledgement on the part of a federal government official. Again, it came in the 8th year of the Obama administration, and while Secretary Fox should be commended for acknowledging this, he's not going to be able to do anything to reverse those policies and to take advantage of this acknowledgement, because he's going to be out of office shortly. So again, I want to emphasize again, public education of adults, not just K through 12, but public education of adults about the de jure nature of our segregated metropolitan areas is, I think, has to be the first priority, because there's not going to be public support to take advantage of this kind of decision without it.
Richard, thank you again for illuminating this history for this audience. I know we'll all take that back to the communities that we work in.
Thank you.
Today, study after study from Harvard to the University of Michigan has concluded that the neighborhood that you grow up in is a major determinant of your economic success. I'm thankful we have the research now to prove what we all knew was intuitive. So perhaps then it's a fortuitous alignment of policy, economic, and demographic imperatives that high-resource communities in Connecticut have realized that they need to add more housing choices to their current stock. That providing these choices will simultaneously support their town vitality and provide more housing choices for low and moderate income individuals in towns with greater access to employment and to transit, and in towns with schools that fit their children's needs. As we've heard, the majority of towns in Connecticut developed the bulk of their housing from 1970 on to meet the needs of the state's baby boomers and their growing families. Not surprisingly then, in two-thirds of our towns, the housing stock is almost exclusively single family. Over half of the homes in our state have 3 bedrooms or more, which doesn't meet the needs of today's demographic drivers, which are the millennials who are entering the workforce and looking to put down roots, working families whose wages continue to stagnate in the recovery, and long-term residents who are seeking to downsize but to stay in town. Just 32 municipalities have 10% or more of their housing that's designated as affordable. We're going to move now to hearing from towns that are at various stages in bringing affordable housing and more housing options to their communities. These are towns that are addressing this challenge proactively, without any judicial mandate, without any enforcement. They've realized that it's in their interest. This is not a partisan issue. This proactivity includes educating residents on who needs affordable housing, what does it look like, and dispelling the common myths, including perceived effects on property values and on crime, that have become the stuff of suburban legend. Previously, there had been little to positively no affordable housing or multifamily housing in many of these communities, so fear of the unknown is not unreasonable. It just needs to be addressed. While there's no formula for success, we know that without community support, these projects and this culture shift is doomed to fail. Guilford has undertaken a comprehensive effort at educating its residents and leaders on what affordable housing looks like today and why it's crucial to its future. So I'd like to welcome the superintendent of the Guilford Public Schools, Dr. Paul Freeman, to the stage. He's going to tell us more about the process that Guilford's undertaken, and then as an educator to talk more about why housing options are needed in town and its benefits. Dr. Freeman is also a member of the state's Achievement Gap Task Force, so he brings a unique and broad lens to this issue of housing affordability. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning. It's interesting for me to be from Guilford, be invited here to tell our story today. I'm happy to tell you our story today, and I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about that different lens as a member of the Achievement Gap Task Force as well. Guilford is a fairly affluent community on the coast. We have a very successful school system. I say that humbly, but as a superintendent, I say that with a great deal of pride. We've got an exceptional school system in Guilford. Again, we're a fairly affluent community. We are not a diverse community by any measure. We are a community, however, that is beginning a conversation about what to do with our housing stock. Our housing stock is almost exclusively single-family homes. In fact, 10 years before becoming the superintendent in Guilford Public Schools, my family and I relocated out of Guilford because we couldn't find a home that met our needs that we could afford on an assistant principal's salary at that time. In Guilford, currently, there are 3 organizations that are working collaboratively to begin this discussion and to have this conversation in our community. There is a town committee that oversees the very limited affordable housing stock that does exist, a town committee that has worked together with the partnership and is working to begin that conversation to broaden those opportunities. We have an interfaith council in Guilford that has taken this conversation very seriously and wants to look at the questions of opportunities for families and for young people in the town of Guilford. And we have a Guilford Foundation, a group of volunteers that has come together for a number of support and programs around the community, but specifically wanting to look at this conversation. The first steps that we have taken are simply that, to begin the conversation, to invite community leaders and to invite community members not to be afraid to discuss affordable housing options in our community. One of the very first steps that we took was the creation of 2 videos. Those videos were created with support from the partnership. Those videos are currently being run on our community television station. They're housed on our town website and town Facebook pages, and they're housed on our school website, which to me is an interesting place to place these videos. I want to share one of the videos with you today, and then I want to talk a little bit about what you might see, what you might hear, and what you might not see and might not hear in that video. So if we could, just take a few minutes, I'd like to share one of those 2 videos with you now.
Well, I think Guilford is a fantastic town. It has, great schools, great education system, great emergency services, great quality of life.
I work in Guilford.
I'm in Guilford, so a lifelong resident of Guilford, and had the opportunity to come back and work in a family business.
I've been in Guilford all my life, and I want to stay in Guilford. I don't plan on going to Florida.
We moved to Guilford 60 years ago as newlyweds. We rented, and then we bought a house, a small house, for $15,000. But that's no longer possible today.
Well, my grandparents moved here in the 50s, and they bought a house on a little better road when that road was a dirt road. And I think it speaks to how much our community has changed, and the needs of our community are changing.
Guilford actually used to be affordable for people who were starting out in their teaching career. There were entire neighborhoods that were developed by teachers and built by teachers. And having stayed in Connecticut for a very long time, in Guilford for a very long time, property values have risen to a point where new teachers now cannot afford them.
My grandfather, my father, and I all raised our families here in Guilford. I'm not confident that my kids can do the same.
I just wish I could get out of the house and have a place I could actually call my own,
Yeah, I mean, Megan's proven to be a great housemate, but, she wants to. My wife and I would love to see her close by, but her options for either a rental property or even a small house are extremely, extremely limited.
I'm a librarian at the Guilford Free Library, and it would really be nice to be able to live in the community that I serve. But right now I don't feel there's very many options for me, as a postgraduate student with a lot of student loans.
Homes in Guilford, most homes are extremely expensive. Even small, fixer-up homes. It's really hard for a young family to be able to come into this community today and find a nice home that doesn't just need tons and tons of work.
And I also wonder whether I'm going to be able to retire in Guilford on a fixed income.
Not a week goes by without people calling in and saying, do you have a rental between $800 or $1,200? And we just don't have the inventory for it.
Affordable options are really key. And for rentals as well as for single-family homes.
Communities like Guilford, suburban communities like Guilford, need to pursue this.
I own a home in town. I have 3 kids in those schools, and recently went through a divorce. And I found it's difficult to find affordable housing in a 2-household situation, and to be able to stay and live in a community where you're trying to raise your children.
When a student family experiences a change in condition, we have students who lose a parent, parent loses a job, family separates. In those situations, too often, the family can't afford to stay in Guilford, which means we end up telling the child that they can't finish their schooling in Guilford schools.
People get worried that affordable housing is a scary word, and it's not. I've lived in Guilford for 24 years, which is essentially my whole life. And for the last 14 years, I've lived in mutual housing's affordable housing neighborhood on Apple Tree Lane. And at the time, my mother had just gone through a divorce. It was still my little brother and I. She worked 3 jobs, and she tried to do everything she could to make all ends meet. And without the affordable housing option, we wouldn't have been able to stay in Guilford.
Our neighbors' needs change according to the stages and challenges of their lives, whether that's young folks starting out on a career or a new family, or folks who've raised a family in Guilford, needing a single-level living in town near services, preserving a great variety of housing stock that folks can afford in Guilford preserves their town's character.
For me, it means that, I could actually afford to live in the town that I grew up loving,
It would allow us to have multi-generational families in the community, and I think that's a super important thing, especially for the younger generations, to have grandparents involved and be able to help the parents raise the kids.
My dream is to have affordable housing in all 4 areas of town, that we have elementary schools, so that no matter what happens to families, there will be affordable housing and children can stay in our schools.
We have entry-level firemen, entry-level policemen, teachers, our town hall workers can't live in town because we don't have affordable housing. And that's one thing I would like to see.
The time is right to address this need for so many of us here in Guilford.
So I'm incredibly proud to be part of a community that's engaging in this conversation. To me, it's exciting that we're putting the conversation out there and that we're discussing these opportunities. As an educator, for me, one of the important components falls around the ability to have teachers who commit to and live in our community, the ability to have students who can have consistency in their education as they move through the years, and not to have families who end up having to relocate their students educationally because they go through a change in condition and no longer can afford to be in the community. Guilford is perfectly located in lots of ways. We are very suburban. Our housing stock is single-family home, but we're located on a rail line. We have a bus line. We've got businesses that are condensed in the center of our town around a green, and businesses that stretch down Route 1. So we would be able to combine housing and work if we were able to move in that direction. The conversation in the video, to me, however, is somewhat limited, because the conversation in the video at this time is talking about opportunities to hold the community that we currently have in Guilford, and that is a concern. We have seniors who want to downsize and then can't find an option that allows them to stay in the community. We have young employees or young families who want to start in the community and can't find a place to find that foothold in that community. And we don't even have enough of that stock to create that healthy reciprocal relationship where one older family can move out of a large home and there's a younger family that's been in town, that's growing, and can move into that. And so we can move those components around. That is currently where the conversation exists. The ability to hire our own librarians, the ability to hire our own teachers or find housing for those folks, and the ability to keep those young families in the community. What you don't hear in this video is discussion about diversity or discussion about segregation or any of the things that Richard mentioned in his conversation today. And please know that I'm not standing up here unaware of that absence. We recognize that absence, but we also recognize that part of our job locally, and there's a real dichotomy for me. I don't live in Guilford any longer. I work for the community of Guilford, and I want to be part of this conversation and making this a comfortable and safe and invitational conversation for the community whom I serve. On the other hand, I also serve at state level on the Achievement Gap Task Force, and we're trying to address the concerns of segregation and closing the achievement gap. I absolutely agree with Richard when he says that we can't close the achievement gap by trying to only desegregate schools. Desegregating a school in a segregated community might be a half step, but it's not an authentic step. If we truly want to desegregate schools, we need to desegregate communities. And how do you entice, how do you engage a community like Guilford to come into that conversation? So it's been with a lot of support from the partnership and a lot of guidance from people wiser than we are to say just start the conversation. Begin the conversation anywhere that your community is comfortable. If we can use this conversation to open up even a few more units along the rail line or along a bus line that are affordable, that open up opportunities for young families to come into that community, then Guilford and other communities who are further along than we are in the work is going to create a community that recognizes that affordable housing works for their community, that affordable housing is a positive that actually enriched the system, that gave our students a more diverse population in their schools with whom to learn, and that it made us a more vibrant community. My hope would be that then at a broader level, as we talk about changing policy, that you've created pockets of enthusiasm and pockets of acceptance around that, rather than pockets of resistance. We are a suburban community, and we don't even abut an urban center. We are a bedroom community for Yale. We have Yale families who live in Guilford and drive into New Haven to work every day. But we don't have other families who can afford to make that commute every day. That's something that we'd like to work towards. We share this with you today proudly, but also humbly. We recognize that this doesn't address the whole issue. I'm excited that at least we're beginning to address the issue. And I think that as the conversation grows, the conversation will become broader and more inclusive and more complete as we continue this work in Guilford. I know that there's other people who have done much more in this area, but I also think we might have some time. No, you don't have any time. I never leave extra time. Thank you for having us today. We're happy to be here.
So what happens once a critical mass of support is there for understanding the need for affordable housing? Bringing affordable housing to towns where it's never been before brings up a lot of mechanical questions, and this is where I'm going to put on my hat as a former developer. How do towns without zoning for multifamily housing move forward? How do towns has development move forward feasibly in communities that don't have sewers? What's the best approach for towns to signal to developers that they're open for business, but also preserve the town's character? We'll learn that these approaches are not cookie cutter. They are highly town specific. And we'll shift now to our panel of experts, and I'd like to welcome them to the stage. Our moderator will be Julie Savin, Director of Real Estate for NeighborWorks New Horizons. Christine Nelson, the Town Planner for Old Saybrook. Mark Barnhart, the Director of Economic and Community Development in Fairfield. And First Selectman Pat Lodra of Newtown. So Julie's on-the-ground experience perfectly suits her to navigate this conversation, and I'm really thrilled to have everyone here. And so I will turn it over to Julie.
How was everyone today? Ready for this great discussion? First, I've been asked to just tell you who I am. And I see a lot of familiar faces and I see a lot of strangers. My name is Julie Savin. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development for NeighborWorks New Horizons. That's our DBA. Our legal name is Mutual Housing Association of South Central Connecticut. We're based out of New Haven. I'm in the Mystic office. I have staff in Waterbury and in Bridgeport. So we're kind of all over the place. We have over 520 units in place that we manage, and we have about 320 in the pipeline. We work from Stonington to Bridgeport up to Sutherland. Our first project was in Guilford, Connecticut. So we've been in business since 1992, and we're just growing like mad. I've also been asked to highlight a particular project that we're working on. It's in Stonington. It's a two-phase project, 43 units per phase. Stonington's an interesting town. It's also the town that I live in, and I'm raising my children, who are African American. It's a white community, 96% white, and there's about 8,500 people who live there, and 18,500 people who live there, 7,665 households, largely single-family homes. This particular project is Spruce Meadows or Spruce Ridge, and it is a low-income housing tax credit development. There is a tremendous amount of money from the Department of Housing, as well as construction financing from Liberty Bank. And we've been working on it since 2010, and we finally broke ground last July. So it took a lot of hard work. And the one thing that Katie wanted me to touch on today was, well, how did we kind of come about working in Stonington? Sort of one of those shoreline, maybe not my backyard kind of communities. There was some land option, but we were also approached by the town. And that's something historically that this organization does. We work in towns where we're welcomed. We work in towns that people ask us to consider. So we did that, and we had some ideas. The main avenue that we took, hold your breath, 8:30 but we were requested to use that mechanism. The town wanted this. The town wanted affordable housing. The town knew that it was necessary. We were losing business because we didn't have housing for workers. So this was a friendly 830G, which we're seeing as sort of a new phenomenon. Towns know that if they can get it through this way, they can actually empower their own residents to kind of get on board. So there were a lot of meetings, there was a lot of training. We even met with P&Z before we even brought our project in. So for us, it was all that collaborative effort. Architectural Review Board was involved, wetlands was involved, zoning, the town planner was very active, all before we even really had any kind of concept, anything like that. So for us, it was a fairly seamless process. For phase 2, we had an option on the land in February, and we got approval and zoning in August. So for those of you that do development, that's a pretty rapid time frame to get the zoning. So for us, we think that it's being in town that gets it, that are doing what Guilford's doing, having the conversation. It was only, maybe 5 years ago, I can remember, many towns wouldn't even have this conversation. So it's a really big deal for me, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud to be part of this. The other thing Katie asked me to touch on is the housing choice, and why is this so important? And it's interesting that when she asked me to do that, I had just read an article that said 1/3 of our nation's households across the income spectrum live in rental housing. 1/3. Some from choice and some from necessity. And it's my belief, personally, you're going to get a lot of Judaisms today, so sorry about that right off the bat. Maybe you'll drink the Kool-Aid, maybe you'll be hating me, I don't know. But it's my belief that it is a critical part of a community's healthy housing mix, ensuring diversity, opportunity, and a labor force for essential community services. So narrow that field down across the income spectrum. We're looking at creating housing choice for people who historically have faced no option for breaking the cycle of poverty, the cycle of crime, the cycle of drug abuse, the cycle of no further education. This project, I hope, will benefit individuals and families that I know in my town, that I know work in my town, that I know that want to live in the town they work in, that want to live in the town that they grew up in and can no longer, just like the faces that we just saw in the video. They want to send their children to a school of their choice. So maybe they do live 20 minutes away. Maybe they do live in London or Norwich, but they know that they want to send their children to a different school. They want to have options. And to be near a support system for daycare, for family, friends, already existing support systems. The wonderful thing about Stonington is that we have a Department of Human Services, social workers, security deposit assistants, heat assistants, job programs, computers available for people to use, a whole litany of things. It's already there and it's free for anybody. To have this collaborative effort for everyone to get together. It's no longer just housing. And it's super sexy to talk about transit-oriented development. But think about our state. There's most communities are not on the rail line. There are many communities that don't have a very good local bus system like us. We have one that takes you an hour to get to the grocery store. And then there are many communities that don't have a bus system at all. But we all can talk education, we can all talk about the workforce, we can all talk about economic development, We can all talk about the fact that folks who just earn a little bit less still pay the same amount for their gas for their car that someone who makes $1 million a year. They pay the same amount at Stop and Shop, they pay the same amount for everything else. So if they're spending 50-60% of their income on housing expenses, they have to make the really hard choices. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it just has to be said over and over and over again. There's a reason why we need to sit collaboratively. We need to sit with our schools. So important. They're often left out of the discussion and not at the table. Our police department has to be at the table. Our human services have to be at the table. Not just housing. And so this is something I know you all know, and it's happening slowly across the country. I've been to many symposiums, and people are doing it. And it's time that we really do it together. And the other thing that's really important about having housing choice is that when many factors limit the earnings of low-income adults, right? We just talked about it. They lack basic skills and credentials. They lack access to quality jobs. They limit access to key work support, such as childcare and transportation, and severe or multiple barriers to employment, including physical and mental health, domestic violence, and so forth. Also, the other thing is to keep in mind sick housing. A lot of sick housing out there. Children who are living in housing that makes them sick. And every time that child can't go to school, that mom or dad can't go to work. And every time that mom or dad misses work, they're at risk of losing that child that took them so long to get in the first place. So I want to take one moment. I could go on about that forever. And if you haven't read the Alice report, please do. United Way put out an amazing report, and it talks about when you're at about $125,000, you can finally actually start a real savings account. A family that has to earn $125,000 after they pay for their housing in Connecticut and all their other needs, that's crazy. So read this report. It's wonderful. Before we move on, I want to take one moment, and I'm looking around, and I'm not seeing some folks from CHFA and DOH, and if you're here, we just wanted to thank you. Nick, hi. We wanted to thank you very much for all the work that you're doing. The governor, who has provided so much affordable housing, and the staff at DOH and the CHFA looking outside the box, and how can we make these fit? And they are, as Katie said, very, very town specific. Now I want to turn to our guests. We're very excited to have you guys here today. We have a remarkable set of town leaders who have gone through this enormous task of what it takes to have affordable housing conversation with their own commissions and residents, and how to effectively plan and create for successful projects proactively. First, I want to introduce Mark Barnhart. He's the Economic Development Director in Fairfield. And he has worked diligently with an affordable housing committee in town to develop policies to incentivize housing for young professionals and housing that's transit-oriented. They've passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance in town whereby a set-aside of affordable housing is required in any project greater than 10 units, be they rental or home ownership, and they've recently broken ground on a 101-unit mixed-income, mixed-use project walking distance to the Fairfield Metro North Station. I hope to hear more about that. We also have First Selectman Pat Lodra, has been the First Select Woman of Newtown for 3 terms, and has worked tirelessly with the support of our town planner and economic development director in a process informed by local builders and developers to pass zoning that will incentivize the development that is needed to support the next generation of Newtown and support economic development in their 5 villages. And I believe there are 2 projects going on, and we hope to hear more about that today too. And Christine Nelson, the planner of Old Saybrook, a town that recently, as we all have probably heard, blazed the path for how the municipality can proactively develop affordable housing and integrate it into its course of business. 10 years ago, the town was alarmed when local teachers realized that students and their families were effectively homeless, living in motels. and brought together a broad coalition led by the interfaith community to facilitate the construction of its first affordable housing project. After completing Ferry Crossing, the first project in the state using the incentive housing zone, there is also a developer now building 186 units adjacent to the Shoreline East Station. In all cases, they've reached their accomplishments with little community opposition, in large part due to patient and thoughtful community education and outreach, careful and inclusive planning. So if we'll move on. Cheers. So Mark, I'm going to turn to you first, if that's all right. Fairfield is an outlier in Connecticut when it comes to school population. It's increasing, correct?
Yes.
We've all bemoaned the fact that our schools are decreasing. And like many other communities, this community lacks elderly and young professional housing. Was a changing demographic a key motivator to the creation of Fairfield's inclusionary zoning policy?
Good morning. Everyone hear me? Yeah. There we go. Good morning. I just want to back up a little bit. So Fairfield created an affordable housing committee back in the mid-'80s, 1980s, and developed its first affordable housing plan in 1989. And in the immediate aftermath of that plan, developed affordable housing using a variety of techniques, making available public land, working with nonprofit organizations to develop housing, actually acting as its affordable housing developer in its own right. And in one instance, making available through a land lease arrangement public property to facilitate development of a mixed use development in exchange for a deed restriction for a number of those units being affordable. And so there was this history that I walked into when I first came to work for Fairfield. Obviously, in the years since that time, initial flurry of activity momentum did slow. Attention was focused elsewhere. There were some highlights along the way. Town worked to purchase property from the U.S. government and convert it for affordable home ownership units using its own general obligation debt to do so. But those opportunities were few and far between. So with the passage of Home Connecticut, the town did take advantage of that opportunity to apply for and receive a grant, which enabled us in our 25 years after the passage of the Affordable Housing Plan to update that plan. And we used that process to engage the community through a series of workshops and neighborhood meetings to discuss affordable housing and the needs of our community and opportunities to create more diversity in terms of our housing stock. And this occurred not in a vacuum. There was occurred against the backdrop of some highly charged, highly contentious state-30G applications that obviously there was a lot of angst within the community concerning some of those applications, both those applications. And so we took every opportunity to talk to neighborhood groups, civic organizations, business groups, and the like about the needs within our community in terms of changing demographics and whether or not we had the right mix of housing to meet both our current and future needs. And as a result, we did develop an affordable housing plan that had a series of about a dozen action steps, one of which was to, which called for the creation of an inclusionary zoning regulation, which this past year the Planning and Zoning Commission unanimously adopted. And it does, as you said, any development, any project that results in an increase of 10 or more housing units shall set aside 10%, not less than 10% of those units as affordable to people at or below 80% of the area median income. And there was a precursor to that as well, which was the development of the Fairfield Metro Center Station, the eastern side of town, along the Bridgeport border. So our third commuter rail station in town, a public-private partnership involving DOT and a private developer. And as part of that, the Planning and Zoning Commission, initially reluctantly at first, but was pushed to update the Plan of Conservation and Development and our zoning regulations to look at the types of uses that would be appropriate around the commuter rail station. And as part of that conversation, they did enact zoning, a text amendment that allowed for a TOD overlay zone, which provided for the first time appropriate density, 50 bedrooms per acre in a mixed-use environment, and importantly, at that time, introduced the concept of inclusionary zoning. So as part of that, you can apply for a development, mixed use, 50 bedrooms per acre, but in exchange, 10% of those units would have to be affordable. But that only applied to that small TOD overlay zone. So that was the beginning of the conversation with the plan of the Affordable Housing Plan development and then the enactment of the inclusionary zoning that now applies townwide.
And if a developer came in, could they pay in lieu of doing it?
We looked at several different options, and we decided ultimately not to have an opt-out provision. So it applies to subdivisions. We revised our subdivision regulations. We also revised our zoning regulations. So it applies both to rental as well as home ownership, any development, whether it's new construction, a conversion, adaptive reuse, redevelopment. If it results in 10 or more units, 10% of those would have to be set aside as affordable.
And you have one project currently using this.
Yeah, the project that you referenced is in the TOD overlay zone, so that took a couple years to actually come to fruition, but it's a 140,000 square foot, 5-story development, which is pretty large when it comes to Fairfield, even around the train station. It'll be 101 units, primarily 1 and 2 bedrooms, over 15,000 square foot of retail space in the first floor. So it's currently, it just broke ground in March. It's under construction. It should be available for occupancy next year.
Congratulations. Okay, I'm going to move to, Pat. How did you identify the need for more housing choice in Newtown? Was there a specific aha moment for you in your community?
I think it's important to, first of all, understand what Newtown is. That we're a community of 60 square miles, 28,000 persons approximately. Our median household income is $108,000. We have very little diversity, economic or ethnic diversity. I should say very little in terms of how the rest of the world looks. We're not as diverse as we need to be or ought to be. But I do want to tell you a little bit of a story of a journey, because I think it typifies the journey that suburban communities like Newtown can engage in to help open that conversation and create a pathway perhaps to look a little different than how we have looked in the past. And we were one of the fastest growing communities in Connecticut in the last decade of the 90s through the early part of the 2000s. Our population grew by more than 20% during that period of time. We were at that point almost exclusively 1 and 2 acre single family homes, very large homes. All of our new developments, all those projects that came in the 90s and early 2000s were large homes with mostly 2 acres, very little consideration to any other kind of housing was in our conversation at all. So in 2007, as soon as we got a chance to catch our breath, we thought, well, let's do a major study. Let's kind of figure out what would we look like if we were fully built out, because we still had at that point 25% of our land that could be developed. We're now at about 21 or 2%, so we still have a long way to go in terms of being a built-out community. So we engaged in a major study with a firm, Planometrics, and we also partnered that with the demographic study. So not only what would we look like in terms of housing and infrastructure if we continued the land use policies in existence then. So we forwarded all of our land use policies and said, okay, let's say we're going to build out completely using the rules that we have now. What are we going to look like? And what's the impact on our infrastructure? What more are we going to need in terms of schools and roads and fire services and police and all of that? So it was quite a major study. and also who are going to be our residents. So we had to kind of look at it from the demographic point of view as well. So that the results of that study came to completion in about 2000, end of 2007, and we were just processing that information, trying to get a handle of, is this what we want to look like? If we continue on the journey we're on at that point, this is what we're going to look like once we're built out. And started to ask ourselves at the community level, is this what we want to look like? Is this the right thing for our community? Well, as we were processing that information, of course, everyone knows what happened in 2008 and 9. The recession informed us in a very different way. We started to pay attention to other metrics. And those other metrics are the relationship between general economic trends, lifestyle choices, and housing. So really to understand what that looks like in a community and the impact of understanding those other metrics. Began to get mixed into the conversation in a really important way. We then partnered a grant with Home Connecticut to do that kind of study, look at our land use, look at what we have available in terms of build out, and give us some guidance in terms of where we could in fact start looking at different kinds of housing stock. So we had that good report as well. One of our next steps then was to meet with contractors and developers. Knowing our community, we understood that we have to have a conversation, but we have to have it in an incremental way. We have to start looking at information in a way that is public and careful and engaging, and everyone can have that careful conversation without the fear that a change is going to be so massive right around the corner that we're losing control of it. So we had a large conversation run by our land use and planner people of bringing in developers and contractors and bankers and everyone who had been involved in the development of Newtown, saying, what do you know about what the future is going to look like in terms of your industry? What should we know? What should we be changing? So that we, as we continue on this build-out journey, we are properly reflective of what the way the world is going to go. I have to admit that my part of that conversation really was very self-centered, and I'm ashamed to admit it still is. I think of it in what is the best for my community. My job is really to ensure that my community is healthy and thrives and grows and is the best of itself. So as we build out, I want us to continue to be just a wonderful place to live and grow and work. So I had not been thinking of it in terms of ethnic diversity, but more in terms of economic diversity. So we have a challenge, as many challenges, many of the suburban areas like Newtown face, and how do we keep our elderly? How do we attract the millennials? What is the importance of that involvement? Why should we care about being diverse? Why couldn't we continue to be a place with single-family homes, 4,000 square feet at 2 acres? Why can't we continue that? But the fact is that the world is not looking like that, and if we're smart, if we want to be a community that continues to thrive, we better shift. We better be a little bit more nimble and navigate our future with more knowledge and information and better engagement with our community. So we used our contractors and developers and bankers and realtors and all those persons who had invested in our growth to help inform our practice. One of the first changes that we made in zoning was a very small change, but it was just kind of teasing out some of those changes. We created what's called an open space conservation subdivision. And all that means truly is that it's a subdivision application process that provides for a different use of space. So you have smaller homes on smaller lots with 50% of that whole land area that constitutes that subdivision dedicated to open space. So it's really just a different way of using land, but it was the first purposeful thing that we did that said, okay, we're going to endorse this concept of smaller spaces, smaller lots, still a lot of open space, because that's really what Newtown is. So that was our first big step. We then started to look more seriously at what does incentive housing zones look like and how could that work in Newtown, and who do we need to have in this conversation. So we have done many public conversations around the issue of what affordable housing looks like. And I think all of us recognize that there's a cultural shift. And that there's a fear, at least we teased out, a fear of the unknown in our community. So for those persons who were accustomed to living and growing up in a place where you have 2 acres and 4 bedrooms and lots of space and lots of green space, and we have no bus line, no rail line, or really a suburban bedroom community. So for those persons, the fear of the unknown was really more an impediment to change than anything else, because I remember hearing in a conversation one resident who had been in our community for many, many, many years comparing what we were talking about to Father Panic Village, which is a classic development in Bridgeport. So we really had to unpack that, really had to help our community understand what it means, what incentive housing and affordable housing looks like. Then we also had to address the issue also raised by persons who had invested most of their life savings in a home in Newtown. What is that going to mean to my house values? Am I going to be punished by the changes that you're trying to bring to our community? So we really had to talk about that. And there's some really good research around the positive impact of having a community where you have diverse families in terms of their economic ability. There's really good research on that can soften that landing and respond to that concern that a person might have that their own home values are going to be diminished because of an invitation, a purposeful invitation into the community for those who don't have tremendous resources. So we're still in the process of really engaging the community in that healthy conversation, but we have 2 projects that have been approved through our planning and zoning. We have an incentive housing overlay zone. And we're very proud of that. We brought it through to completion with our planning and zoning board with lots of positive conversation with our community, great leadership on the part of our staff, and then approving the 2 projects by special exception. The concerns were not so much around density, which really is the earmark of our project, it's really around traffic. So it's a more normal conversation that drives those concerns about development in a community such as mine. So the 2 projects we have, one is with a 65 condominium units, so 20% of those will be identified as deed restricted affordable, and then another project of 180 units, which will be apartments, but again, 20% of those set aside for affordable. These are very significant projects for our community because it's and they're on opposite ends of the town too. So, and we are establishing in what is our villages. We have 5 villages because we are so large. In terms of land space, we develop our villages. We have specific development plans for each of our villages. So the 2 projects are on opposite ends of the town in 2 totally different villages, but I think will have a substantial impact, a cultural impact, a positive cultural impact on those villages. We're trying to develop those walkable, bikeable spaces around our commercial centers. Each of these developments are located in that way. So they'll be supported by the ability to walk to a local restaurant, other amenities that are in that village. One of the largest of the projects is also located near I-84 interchange. So we're trying to be smart in the way we incorporate those projects into our community. But I think the messaging for me, the message to our community is that we will be very careful and we respect that this is a cultural shift for some people. We have to help people understand and accept and be welcoming of those changes. And we are confident that the changes that we're pursuing are in the best interests of our community, that we will thrive and grow, and we will build out in a way that's different than what we thought we were going to look like, but it's a better place that we're going, not the same place, but a better place.
Thank you very much. I have lots of questions for you, but next I want to take it to Christine, is from Old Stable, as I mentioned, and Christine's town, as I mentioned, also passed the first affordable housing, the incentive housing zone in Connecticut. And we talked earlier, you said there was virtually no opposition to this. Can you bring us back briefly to the beginning, but then give us an idea how this project
is now functioning in the community?
Just to give a little context too about Old Saybrook, another shoreline town, we are TOD, the train station, affluent, easy math, the area median income is 100,000 or so, 80% of that is 80,000, 60% of that is 60,000. So that's been easy for us to frame income disparity within the town. One of the things I also walked into, similar to Mark, was a long history of the town looking at housing, and one of the best things to do when you get a job is to look at what previous planners have been doing, and take a quick audit of what has been implemented. And I have to say, Old Saybrook has planned well, and they have implemented well. We have the full the full a la carte of every technique, every tool that's out there that's been made available through the state, through the federal government. I'm not saying that we've done everything to the fullest extent, but the idea is that you work on all of it all the time, through administrations, through careers, and you keep working on it because the need is always there, and there's support for different things at different times. And just a little precursor to Ferry Crossing, which is the poster child, soon to be supplanted by a new poster child in our town. I walked into the job in Old Saybrook, and the first thing that happened to me was a developer came in and he said, "Listen, I've got 12 acres in the center of town that I bought and got approved for a shopping center, and the market has fallen off, and I don't have an anchor, and I can't get tenants, and I paid too much for it to begin with. I don't know what to do with it, and I would like to test the waters with a big box retail store," which was not a popular item at the time, and he didn't get a warm reception, and I think he wanted to kind of slap the town a little bit, and he brought in an affordable housing development that was very large. And the commission said, "Oh, we don't have any apartments, and we don't have any rental. Maybe our kids could move back to town." And as a staff person, I kind of went, they just called his bluff. And, it was this beautiful moment. I was so proud of my boards and commissions for just honestly, genuinely saying, wow, we need a variety of housing types and ownership types. So that came through as a not friendly 830G, but it was great because from that point forward, all 830Gs were friendly. Everyone was familiar with it. They cut their teeth on that, and everything that came in after that was smaller and more palatable. And so 830 Old Saybrook's open for business for 830G. But that did sort of pave the way for the Housing for Economic Growth program through, it was Office of Policy and Management at that time in the late, 2007, 2008. So Old Saybrook dove right in, and as you mentioned, we had St. Mark's, the Lutheran Church, had a homework club for kids who were living in motels. So what they said was, after school, instead of going back to the motel, come to the church, do your homework. And it turned into this interfaith effort to educate the town about the need for affordable housing, and it was very well received. A local nonprofit community development organization came up around that called Hope Partnership. And our first selectmen, our entire board of selectmen who were there for 12 years were fantastic advocates. And that is really what you need for long-term. We do our jobs, but we can't advocate. We can advise, but the advocacy's really got to come from leadership. And if it's not there, then what happens is the whole effort backslides for a little bit until something else happens. So we had a very interesting set of circumstances for Ferry Crossing. I'll get to your question now, which is There was a piece of property on the state's excess properties list. The town asked for it. We were given it. We had it designated for recreation and affordable housing. At the same time, the state was giving out their technical assistance grants. We applied for one. We used that for due diligence and pre-development costs and permitting. With Hope Partnership, meanwhile, the town sponsored the update to the zoning map and the zoning regulations after a very careful analysis of the entire town according to the parameters of the incentive housing zone. We identified 3 areas of town that we thought were eligible for it, and we started with that area of town, which is Ferry Point. It's the easternmost part of town, and it overlooks the Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. Gorgeous. Then we also got involved with the Women's Institute, who came in there with the developers who put the project together for all of us. So the town ended up being the landlord. We have a land lease to Hope Partnership, and it's been a great project. It's 16 units. 100% of the units are deed restricted as affordable. We did meet the density requirements for IFC, even though we didn't have to. And the income percentages are, there's a few units that are at 25% of town's area median income, right? No, state median income. Oh no, area median income for IFC. 25%, there's a bunch that are 50%, there are a few that are 80%, so it's a broad spectrum. And then the folks who are in there are the characters that we all are advocating for. We've got people in the fire department, we've got town employees, we've got veterans. It's a success story. It's great.
That's great.
Yeah.
I've been told we're running out of time, so I wanted to open it up to all of you. If you have questions for the panelists, I know I do, but I'd like to hear from you. If there's anyone.
I'm just curious if at any point the conversations of regionalization have come into play when you talk about how you bring diversity of socio and ethnicity into your communities, and whether or not your towns are actively pursuing it or opposed to it, or how regionalization is in the conversation.
We're just beginning to have some serious conversations about that, particularly with the strong push at the state level, particularly through the legislature, to ensure that municipalities look at every opportunity to regionalize as a way to reduce costs. So we border Danbury and have very good partnership with Danbury in a lot of aspects of our regional practices. So we're just starting the conversation to say, what could it look like as Danbury continues to experience pressure in residential growth? Should we be looking to partner with them in some way, since we share a border with them? So we're just starting that.
Fairfield's an inner suburb of Bridgeport, and so to respond to that, I would say that the traditional approach has been, well, Bridgeport has a lot of affordable housing stock, so why do we need to actually step up and do something? So I think part of it was, and that's true, there are other places. I happen to live in a neighboring town that has much more affordable housing than does Fairfield as well. So I think part of the conversation that we were trying to frame was a way in which we could step up and address our own issues with respect to providing more housing choice, more housing opportunities for Fairfield. So that's just how we approached it.
We just finished a regional economic development plan, or a study that has a lot of recommendations, but we do see that our new incentive housing development will have a regional draw. It's 186 units of apartments that are 20% deed restricted as affordable, and because of its location on the train, so we see a regional draw but within the region, but also via the train outside of the region.
Can I just follow? If you do consider that, will you change your standards to regional affordability, regional MI, rather than area MI? Because as you said, you're $100,000 income range, so $20,000 may still be out of reach for a new population. Would you adjust the income limitations to meet the region rather than the area?
You know, those are set by the state. The programs define where you get that from. I'm not sure that there's flexibility in that.
And ours is, the median area, the median family income for Fairfield is much different than it is in Bridgeport. So by virtue of the fact that we're an area median income, our income limits for our affordable housing developments are much lower than what you would find in Fairfield if we were looking at Fairfield exclusively, right?
I just want to add one of the impediments that places like Newtown experience, and I think it's typical of a lot of suburban areas. We're not served by a bus line, and we're finding that transportation is a critical issue here. If we're going to be successful in developing housing stock that is attractive to workforce population, we've got to have transportation opportunities as well. So even though we border Danbury, we are handicapped in that we don't have ease of transportation unless one has their own car. So that's another issue that suburban areas like Newtown have to confront.
Hi, I was wondering, this morning we've heard a great deal about ethnic, racial, economic disparities and what the towns are doing to address that. I'm wondering if any of you experience, how do you work with folks who have physical or mental health disabilities? You know, it's an easy sell. Oh, they're going to bring in, it's our firemen. Oh, wouldn't you want to give a home to a veteran? Gotcha. What are we doing for those people who have physical or mental health disabilities? How does that fit into this?
Folks with, we have a number of opportunities currently for folks with disabilities, and I think that was an important part of the conversation as we developed affordable housing. That was certainly front and center, at least in the part of some people's minds, that we needed to provide those housing. We had people with adult children with developmental disabilities that didn't have a place to stay. So that was very much a part of the conversation as we were developing a variety of different housing options. So I think that's really how we frame the conversation, is how do we create a variety of different housing options for people in Fairfield of all walks and income levels.
And if I could even comment on that, I think that it comes down to that holistic collaborative thing I mentioned earlier. I think that for many years we've been developing housing, and some funding opportunities encourage supportive housing mechanisms. But prior to that, it was just build the box and walk away. Mm-hmm. We have this project in Stonington, and we have 22 units that are for folks that are 25% AMI or less. And while we're not doing supportive housing per se, we recognize that partnering with the Stonington Department of Human Services, who's going to not only help us lease up those units, but will follow those tenants and provide the services that they need. It's a natural connection to the community. Again, it's a collaborative thing that we need to really embrace. Can we force municipalities to put that in their zoning? Not now. But, at some point, these are our residents, and we do have to acknowledge that they need housing just like everybody else. I'm sorry.
I just want to say that we're not sophisticated enough yet, I think, in the conversation. I think we're not as aware as we need to be, that we need to be more inclusive in our conversation and understanding about what housing should look like in order to provide those supports for all of our residents. We're very siloed. So when we talk about supportive housing, it is for a specific population, not to be integrated with other persons. So I think we need to be able to break down those walls in our conversation first before we have any really effective strategies.
I want to remind everyone that Dr. Freeman is still here, so we didn't have an opportunity to ask him questions. So if you have them.
Mark, I'm curious why you, with the development of your inclusionary 10% set-aside requirement, you didn't look towards a P&E payment or alternative method of compliance to provide for greater flexibility to produce affordable units.
We really wanted to make sure it was inclusive, that as development opportunities presented themselves throughout town, regardless of where they were located, that there was an opportunity to provide for some affordable housing as part of those housing developments that went forward. So in our view, having a payment in lieu or an opt-out provision just gave folks an easy out, and whether it was in the hands of the developer or, as in some cases, in the hands of the zoning commission, we didn't want to necessarily give that opportunity. It was important to us that we provide for housing throughout the town. And so we set the bar low in the sense that it was a 10% set aside with households at or below 80%. And we also did that consciously because while the housing market is fairly robust in Fairfield, we also didn't provide, as you might find in other inclusionary zoning regulations, any other types of incentives or set-asides or other provisions to assist the developer in meeting that threshold requirement. So it's pretty much applies across the board. It's a very simple concept. I think it's a very simple concept to explain for people to get. It's one paragraph. I've looked at a lot of other provisions, and there are multiple pages. So it was easy for us to explain both to the commission and the public what we were trying to accomplish.
I think we have time for one more question. Tom got the first word, gets the last.
Thank you. To Pat, you said you've got 21% of your town still open space. Is there anything that prevents or inhibits that land from being developed?
No, it is, as communities build out, the easiest land to develop is the land that's developed first. So the 20% or so of the land that remains eligible for development is not the easiest land to develop. So I think there is no impediments that we're learning that you can build on almost any kind of terrain. So we anticipate that land is in fact subject to development at some point as we build out the community.
I have a quick question. I know that was supposed to be the last one, but I'm dying to ask it. And this is really for Pat and Mark. You've passed these zoning regulations recently, and I know that you're really in the infancy stages, Pat, but you've been doing it a long time, Mark. What about a deeper dive? We're talking about 80% of the area median income, but what about our folks out there who still work really hard? They're the folks that serve us coffee every day, or those kinds of jobs, and they work 40, 60 hours a week, but they fall 50 or 30 or 25% of the area median income. Any plans or to discuss bringing that into your regulation?
Well, there's a hope and a vision and a prayer for the future. I can, it's my task as the CEO to help guide that conversation and move the community toward that better end. So I think incrementally we will move toward that. What we need to do is land these two projects successfully. We need to be able to incorporate this new understanding of who we are into our community with that kind of welcoming, careful, embracing ethic, so that the next step doesn't feel quite as scary. So I am by nature an incrementalist, and I've learned, at least in my community, that that's the most successful way to achieve a significant cultural change.
I would agree with that. I think we had to take an initial first step to re-energize the community around this conversation. We do have other tools in our toolkit to facilitate those types of development. Whether or not they're as effective as they need to be is something we need to constantly reevaluate. So I think it's just the beginning of a conversation, and hopefully we'll build on the successes that we have.
I want to take this time to thank the panelists for joining us.
All of our speakers today for so comprehensively addressing the issues of housing choice and affordability. We always look to our IForum beginning of the conversation and at the end, and we hope to continue those with you. On your seats, you have a flyer for our next event in next month, multifamily speed dating. Some of you will recall this event from 2014. We brought together 50 towns, 50 development professionals from Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. This is not Tinder. We're looking for meaningful relationships. Town planners are often juggling many responsibilities, and we wanted to provide one-stop shopping for them, but we also knew that the development community wasn't aware enough of all the communities and municipalities in Connecticut that are eager to develop this housing. So take a look, and if you're interested, please consider registering. Thank you again for your attendance today, and we'll see you at the next IForum. Enjoy the rest of your day.